know a little bit more about clinical trials and ultimately have a better understanding of if a clinical trial is something you would like to participate in. So John, if you could go to the next slide. So yeah, so this slide is just an overview of what we'll be discussing today. We will start with an overview of clinical trials and discuss some history. We will then go into more details about the design and structure of a trial, and we will finish off with some additional resources for you, and we'll dispel also a few myths that exist regarding clinical trials. Okay. So we'll start off with really a lengthy definition, but don't let that scare you away. So a clinical trial is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include a placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So that is a very long way of saying that a clinical trial is a type of scientific investigation that aims to assess whether or not a medical treatment works. In order to determine this, we have a number of volunteers that participate in the clinical trial. We randomly put them into one or two or more groups, depending on whether they get the new treatment or not. And then we look at the differences between those groups. We all have received some form of medical treatment in our lives, whether it's chemotherapy, surgery, or even something as simple as antibiotics. And in all cases, a clinical trial is really how we figure out which treatments work and which ones do not. So we're going to discuss a little bit more about this structure in more detail in the subsequent sections. But could you go on to the next slide? Perfect. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about history. So how long have clinical trials existed? Well, humans figured out a long time ago that in order to figure out what foods, medicines, or lifestyles lead to better health, we need to compare groups of people that eat different foods or have different lifestyles. One of the earliest clinical trials could be from the book of Daniel in the Bible, where two groups of people in Babylon with different diets were compared. The normal diet, consisting of meat and wine, was compared to a separate group of people that thought that they would have better health if they ate legumes and drank lots of water. So when this comparison was done, people noticed that the legume eaters had better health. But there is a problem here. The people that decided to differ from the rest of society and change their diet might have actually been different in other ways other than diet as well. So although it looks like the diet difference was the important difference here, it's important to note that clinical trials need to be carefully designed to ensure that you get results that are very clear. So this was a very long time ago, of course, and since then we've gotten a lot better with how we do clinical trials. So the first trial that involved randomly placing individuals into groups and assessing the effectiveness of a treatment on a specific disease was a tuberculosis trial. So they wanted to see if a specific antibiotic helped people to recover from tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection in the lungs. They randomly placed people with tuberculosis into either a control group, where they got bed rest and fluids, as was the standard of care at the time, or a treatment group that had both bed rest, fluids, and also the antibiotic. So doing this ensured that the only difference between these two groups was the antibiotic. Therefore, when the treatment group receiving the antibiotic ended up clearing the infection much faster than the other group, we can be confident that the antibiotic helped to clear this tuberculosis infection. Perfect. Now, historically, we've learned a lot from how previous clinical trials were conducted. Unfortunately, there are times throughout history where clinical trials have not been conducted ethically. And in response to this, there's been a lot of legal changes made to ensure that clinical trials are done as ethically as absolutely possible. So, for example, the Nuremberg Code established rules for voluntary consent, which prioritized the importance of informing participants of exactly what is involved with the trial before they commit to participating. It also made it mandatory for people to be able to remove themselves from any experiment at any time and without any coercion or pressure to stay in the study until completion. Later on, the Declaration of Helsinki took things further in 1964 with more recommendations that have actually been continuously updated over the years. A few key points from that document include making patient safety and well-being the top priority in the trial. the establishment of research boards, which do a very extensive risk-benefit analysis on every scientific study to ensure that they are all done as ethically as possible. The importance of all data collected in the trial to be completely anonymous was also in this document, and this was done to protect the privacy of participants. And many other improvements as well are outlined in this document. These act as a binding guideline that researchers must consider when developing a study to increase the chances that it is ethically sound and then ultimately approved by a research ethics board when it is reviewed. Now, things in Canada have even more checks in place with clinical trials, as they are also reviewed by the Health Products and Food Branch, which is basically like the Canadian FDA. So if a trial is completed and definitively shows that a treatment is both safe and better than the current standard of care, it is then reviewed by the HPFB, and then, only then, if it's approved, it can enter the market in Canada. After this, the work is not done because there's continuous safety monitoring that occurs for years. So this whole process is very lengthy, and there are immense numbers of checks in place, which can make clinical trials really difficult to understand and interpret if you weren't too familiar with them. So that's actually one of the purposes of the talk today. So you can go on to the next slide. And I will now hand over the microphone to my colleague, John, to discuss more about the structure of clinical trials.
Thank you, Matthew. We're going to move on to a description of clinical trials now more in depth. Why do we do them? What are the different stages or phases, the different types, the randomized control trial, and clinical equipoise. And the last three, my colleague Sarah will be discussing more in depth about. So why do we do clinical trials? So here's a quick schematic of basically one of the ways in which scientific progress is achieved, if you will. The main point of clinical trials is to take findings from the research laboratory to improve the health of human lives. And I think that's the basic interpretation of science conducted in many different fields. So with basic science, you're basically looking at things like cell lines or other experiments. You might look at different molecules, something like proteins, and you're trying to see if they can do something that might be beneficial to humans. And if we find that they have some promising results, then we move on to an area of translational research, where now we're trying different live models. So we might be trying these in mice, for example, to see if any drug or compound might be doing some beneficial effect that we saw when we did it earlier in the different cell lines or the different experiments beforehand. And if we find anything interesting from there, then that's when we shift into the phase of clinical trials. And then that's when we start getting humans involved, and we have different ways to see whether or not whatever compound we're testing does have a beneficial outcome. I'll give you an example. So an example is the advent of immunotherapy. So many of you may have heard that immunotherapy, relatively recently has been on the radar for many scientists and clinicians alike because of some of the touted benefits it's had in specific cancers. So first, many years ago, we started to see how specific molecules could play a role in cancer, and whether we could block these molecules, it could be beneficial to fighting the cancer. And from there, we moved on to translational models where we would test these compounds in mice, and we would see, for example, that when we gave these molecules, the cancer wouldn't grow as fast, or the cancer would completely go away. And then finally, we would test these in humans, and now that we're seeing some of the results come out, we're seeing that different types of immunotherapies do have some pretty good benefits for humans. Now, you'll notice this last arrow, which actually goes back towards basic science. And the idea here is that this is a continuing loop where each one of these nodes feeds into the next. So with clinical trials, for example, we're finding that yes, immunotherapy does work for some cancers, but it doesn't seem to work for the vast majority of them, interestingly. So if we take a cancer example, like anything, pancreatic cancer, we'll see that not all tumors respond to this. So once we see this observation, we go back into the lab and we start doing some basic science research again to see why this is the case. And then we continue the cycle until hopefully we find some more advances for other types of cancers that may not benefit from whatever treatment type you're looking at. So as we're pointing out here, clinical trials are a fundamental part of progressing basic science into therapies to advance human health. Now, this is a complex slide, but we'll go through with it point by point. And the point of this is to outline the different stages or phases of clinical trials. So you'll see the first note here, and that's phase 0. Now, phase 0 usually isn't done. It is not done. It's usually, when it is done, it's to streamline the drug approval process. And it's to answer questions like, does the drug reach the tumor? How do cancer cells respond, etc. But unfortunately, there isn't much benefit to the patients enrolled. It's more benefit for the future patients that may end up having this drug in the future. But at the same time, because there are low doses, there's less risk for the patient as well. Note that we don't need a phase 0 for drug approval. So the goal is, as we said, to explore if and how a new drug may work. And usually the sample size is relatively small. It's usually about less than 15 patients. Then we move on to phase 1. And this is one of the phases that's more often than not part of the progression into the different phases for clinical trials. So phase 1 tests the safety and the dose range of a particular drug. It's given to a small proportion of the group first, and then if it's safe, you'll increase the dose and give it to a new group. And as I said, the point of this is to see the different ranges of doses that can be given to patients and investigate potential side effects that they may receive or they may have. There is usually no placebo arm given in this group. You'll notice me using different terms like arm and placebo, and we'll define those in the next slide. The main outcome of this is not to look at disease response, but as I said, to see the efficacy, the safety of the drug. You usually have different cancers involved, so it's not just one specific cancer type. As I said, the goal of this is to see if the drug is safe. It's usually between 20 and 80 patients, and the outcome is to determine the highest dose that humans can take without causing severe side effects. Now, phase 2. Phase 2 is looking at the optimal dose. So now we're testing whether the drug actually works, where it's doing its intended effect. And we're usually using the dose that we figured out to be the safest from phase 1. Everyone gets the same dose, and if not, they can get randomized to different treatment arms, and then from there, they may get different doses, or they may receive the doses in different ways to see which dose is most effective, emphasizing that efficacy is the point of this stage of the clinical trial process. If enough benefits are seen and few side effects are observed, then the drug moves on to phase 3. And again, in here, no placebos are given. To reiterate, for a phase 2, we're asking, does the drug work? The sample size is larger than before, ranging from 25 to 100 patients. And again, these are ballparks. The specific trial may differ a bit. And the outcome is to see whether the drug works for the cancer that we are trying to treat. So now we get more specific to the cancer of interest. Now, phase 3 is the longest phase of the clinical trials, and it's unfortunate usually where most drugs fail because it's a bit more rigorous, mainly because it's testing how this new drug compares to the standard of care. So we're checking for safety and mainly effectiveness. Here, placebos may be used, but more often than not, we're giving the standard of care because it's unethical to give a placebo when we know that there is a standard of care, and we're maintaining the notion of clinical equipoise, which Sarah will allude to later on. As I said, the goal here is to see whether we're doing any better compared to the standard of care. So an example would be for a specific cancer, they might receive a specific type of chemo. We're going to see whether this new drug does better than the standard chemo that patients are given. The size, it can be in the hundreds, it can be in the thousands. It's usually much larger, and more often than not, you're going to involve many different countries. So these are usually international trials. And the outcomes are to see whether the treatment is better than the standard. Now, usually once a drug passes these 3 stages, 0 if it's included, but really this doesn't affect the process. So usually these 3, then it can get approval depending on the country. In Canada, as Matthew stated, it's the HPFB who oversees this process and approves drugs for use in Canada. In the United States, it's the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. Once a drug passes this, then it's given to the general population. And at this point, the drug is considered relatively safe, but not only that, effective to whatever it's being administered for. Now, we do a phase 4 to see whether the drugs that have already been approved have any long-term side effects. And these are usually hard to see when you're doing a clinical trial phase 3 because phase 3 doesn't last that long. It lasts long, but not as long as checking for long-term side effects 4, 5, 10 years down the line. And if anything is found harmful, then the drug is immediately withdrawn to minimize any negative impacts on the population. Now, this entire process can last anywhere from 15 years in the United States, similar in Canada. And as I said, usually phase 3 is the longest and the arduous one, the most arduous one of the entire tasks. Now, a few terminology, some terminology before we move on. So I mentioned some of these and we'll define them here. So allocation is simply the act of placing a patient into different arms of a study. But what's an arm? It's a specific comparison of a trial. So this would include a treatment arm and a control arm. So some patients may be allocated into a treatment arm where they'll receive this experimental drug, and some patients will be allocated into a control arm where they're administered either a placebo, but usually the standard of care. Blinding is the process of removing information from an observer. Now, you can have double blinding or you can have triple blinding. Double blinding refers to the manner in which neither the patient nor the physician knows what the treatment arm, knows whether or not the patient is receiving a drug. This way, any differences that we may observe in response is due to the effects of the drug, assuming all other variables, for lack of a better word, are controlled for, as opposed to some sort of a bias that may exist. This is the gold standard. And again, Sarah will talk about this a bit more when she talks about randomized controlled clinical trials. We can also have triple blinding, where neither the patient, the physician, nor the people analyzing the data knows where the patient is enrolled in, whether it's the control arm or the treatment arm. Control is what treatment, drug, or intervention is being compared to the treatment. The gold standard is usually what's commonly accepted as ideal. So the gold standard for a particular cancer treatment might be chemotherapy or it might be radiotherapy. The placebo or sham would be a harmless substance that's given in place of a treatment. Now, placebos and shams may be used for phase 3 clinical trials, but they're not used for phase 1 and 2. Also note that the placebo is still given because a placebo can still affect how the drug is responding. So what do I mean by that? The simple act of administering something to a patient can in itself make the patient perhaps feel that something has been different with them. So we give a placebo, for example, if we're injecting some sort of a vaccine, or we might just inject water. And then that way we're determining whether any effects that the patient has are due simply because of the actual drug and not just the act of injecting something into the patient. So a placebo is meant to try to control for the effects of simply giving something to the patient. For randomization, it's the act of allocating patients into different arms of a trial using chance. And what do I mean by this? So randomization is important. To give you an example, you can, for example, create 2 groups and you might give drug A to one group and drug B to another group. And then you find that drug B, the patients who receive that drug end up doing better in whatever outcome that we're checking. But we also find out later that patients who received drug B were also older. So now we don't know whether the drug is working because the patients are older or because the drug is actually causing an effect. And the point of randomizing is to ensure that we're trying to control for any external factor that might affect the outcome, like age, like sex, prior treatments, etc. So randomization, again, is very important. Standard of care, as I said, is the treatment, drug, or intervention that's commonly given to a patient for the treatment of that condition. It can be synonymous with gold standard. So a standard of care, as I said, for cancer, maybe giving chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And then treatment is simply the drug or intervention being tested. So now that we went over some of the basics of the different terms used in clinical trials and the different stages or phases, I'll let my colleague Sarah now explain a bit more about the different types of clinical trials and touch on the gold standard, the randomized controlled clinical trial.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. So when we think of a clinical trial, we often immediately think of a drug company that's testing out a new medicine to help see if it cures a disease. However, there's a wide range of clinical trials out there that actually span all aspects of healthcare. So clinical trials don't necessarily just look at new drugs or just look at curing a disease. For example, we may want to see if a new treatment helps prevent the development of disease, and these are called prevention trials. So in the context of cancer, a possible question that a prevention trial could ask could be, does a certain treatment help prevent cancer? The participants in prevention trials are generally people that do not currently have the illness that is being studied, since we're wanting to see if some form of intervention changes the chance of someone developing this illness. Therefore, the participants in prevention trials are usually the general population, or a population that's at increased risk of getting the disease, such as those with a family history of cancer. However, it's important to note that having had a disease like cancer in the past doesn't necessarily prevent you from being eligible for prevention studies, because some prevention studies are actually interested in seeing if a treatment helps prevent the recurrence of the disease. So if this new treatment helps prevent cancer from coming back. So a second type of clinical trials is what is called screening trials. In this type of trial, we may be asking the question, does a certain test help catch cancer before symptoms arise? A good example of this is the Pap test, which is used to screen women for cervical cancer. When the Pap test was first developed, it would have gone through a screening trial to see if screening the general population for cervical cancer with this Pap test helped to catch the disease before the symptoms arose, and then if catching this disease early actually led to the patient doing better in the long run. So the usual participants in a screening trial are patients without cancer, since these trials are looking to see if screening actually helps prevent and helps, not prevent, rather catching this disease early. Therefore, screening trials usually involve the general population, or again, a group of people that are at risk of developing a disease, such as those with a family history of cancer. A third type of clinical trial are what are called supportive care trials. So here the trial is looking at the bigger picture of patient management and is asking if a certain management plan could improve patient comfort and quality of life. So the management plan that is being tested could include a really wide range of care, such as involving occupational therapy or physiotherapy or speech therapy into patient care and seeing if doing so helps patients do better in the long run. Participants in this type of trial are often cancer patients or cancer survivors. And since these trials look at patient quality of life and how they're doing as a person, as a whole person, these trials often incorporate the families of patients. So finally, we have what are called treatment trials. And so treatment trials are what we classically think of when we think about clinical trials. They are testing out a new type of treatment. And this new type of treatment can be medication, a new type of surgery, testing out a combination of existing medications. There really are many, many subtypes of treatment trials. But no matter what treatment they're testing out, treatment trials will ask the following two questions. What are the side effects or safety profile of a treatment, like John talked about in some of the earlier phases? And does a new treatment improve patient outcomes compared to the current treatment? Excuse me. So the question they're asking, pardon me, I apologize. There we go, I think we have a voice back. So does this new medication help patients do better than the current types of medications that we give? So as John mentioned, the gold standard of treatment trials are what we call randomized controlled trials. Next slide, please. So a randomized controlled trial is our best way of finding out if a new treatment works and is better than what we currently use. So the participants in a randomized controlled trial are generally patients with an illness. So in the context of cancer, these would be cancer patients. The key idea to randomized controlled trials, and what gives them their name, is that the participants are randomized into two different treatment groups. As John mentioned, this is done to try to make the groups as similar as possible for things like average age, gender, other illnesses the participants might have. This randomization is the best way to get the two groups as similar as possible. And this is important to do so because, like John talked about, if at the end of a trial we see one group did better than the other, we can confidently say that it was because it was the treatment and not just because the other group happened to be different in other ways. So this picture here is a schematic of how a clinical trial would run from start to finish. So first on the left, you see that we would start off with an initial population. So everyone, for example, that has a breast cancer diagnosis. These patients would be assessed for eligibility to see if they're able to be part of the study. So eligibility criteria would differ between studies. For example, maybe they're only looking at a certain subtype of breast cancer, or patients who have had a certain type of chemotherapy, etc. So these are all important factors to look into to see if you are eligible for a clinical trial, and your oncologist would have the answers to this. So after eligibility is assessed, you end up with this eligible population. So this population is then randomized into these two arms, a control arm where they receive the standard of care, so what is usually given to patients. It's really important to note here that this group is not denied treatment. They would be treated the exact same way that they would have if they were not part of this trial. They're given the usual standard of care treatment. The other half of the group is put into the treatment arm. This group will receive the experimental treatment. And often in cancer trials, this includes the standard of care plus a new medication. So both groups will be closely followed by a medical team, and the end result will be a final report and ideally change in the treatment recommendation. So next slide, please. So one key point that underlies all clinical trials is something we call clinical equipoise. So this term can formally be defined as the assumption that there's not one better intervention present for either the control or the experimental group during the design of a randomized controlled trial. So what exactly does that mean? So in other words, clinical equipoise refers to the fact that doctors and the organizers of the trials genuinely do not know what treatment will be better, and they're doing the trial to figure out if and which one of the options is better than the other. So clinical equipoise is based around the fact that it would be unethical to run a trial on something we already have evidence that works, and you would then be denying people access to it. The presence of clinical equipoise is absolutely essential for a clinical trial to be approved. So you can be assured that any clinical trial run in Canada has this point underlying it. And with that comes the fact that as a trial progresses, that if there is sufficient evidence to show that one treatment group is proving to be much better than the other treatment group, the trial can be stopped and all patients will be moved over to that other treatment. So clinical equipoise underlies all clinical trials that are currently run in Canada. I'll pass that back over to Matt here.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. So I will now discuss a little bit about resources that you might find useful, and as well as dispel some myths that exist about clinical trials. So next slide, please. Perfect. So if you leave the talk today with the idea that you might want to learn more about specific trials or just about clinical trials in general, we encourage you to have a conversation with your oncologist or your doctor. So here are a few questions that we came up with that you could ask to start this conversation. So you could ask, I've heard about clinical trials. Could you tell me more? Or you could say, I've read about a specific clinical trial. Do you think it's a good idea? You can ask, will this clinical trial have an impact on me and my care? And if so, how? What specific considerations do I need to consider if we enroll in a clinical trial? And what happens if I decide that I want to leave a trial after I've enrolled? So these are some questions just to initiate the conversation. And now we're going to go over a few myths about clinical trials. So I apologize for it being a bit small there, but I'll read through them with you. So one myth is, I should only participate in a clinical trial as a last resort after I've exhausted all of my treatment options. In fact, clinical trials exist for all stages of cancer. And as Sarah mentioned, studies also exist for cancer screening and cancer prevention. Another myth is I could get the placebo in a clinical trial and therefore ineffective therapy. Well, The placebo is actually rarely used in cancer clinical trials. Usually, you will either receive the best current treatment, so the standard of care, or a new and possibly more effective therapy. Another myth is, I won't be able to withdraw from a clinical trial after enrolling in one. So this is not true. You have rights as a participant, and you can withdraw from a clinical trial at any time. Another myth is that clinical trials are too dangerous. This one's kind of tricky because, there are always risks associated with treating diseases such as cancer. Clinical trials are run because prior rigorous studies have been conducted to predict likely positive outcomes. So your physician and clinical team will discuss any risks and concerns with you, but this will likely depend very much on the specific clinical trial that you're discussing. Another myth is that you'll be treated as a guinea pig in a clinical trial. And while it's true that clinical trials are types of experiments, clinical trial participants often have a very positive experience. So they are well informed of the risks and benefits and are followed closely by their clinical team and are treated with dignity. And just something else to note here, these researchers are usually very, very concerned with how you're doing. And usually you get perhaps even more attention from the clinical staff than you would if you weren't in the trial, because they're monitoring very closely for even subtle side effects. And finally, I'm too old to participate in a clinical trial. Well, patients of all ages can participate in a clinical trial, and as our population ages, older patients are a vital group in clinical trials. This is to ensure that these therapies are not just effective in younger people that received the therapy, but also in older populations. Great, so finally, we have some resources here for you. The Canadian Cancer Society on clinical trials and the American equivalent are good for information about what a clinical trial is, similar to what we have discussed today. We've also included both a Canadian and international registry where you could go and see what specific trials are currently being done and which ones are actually enrolling participants. Next slide. Perfect. So yeah, so this is the end of our talk, but I want to thank you again for your time today. I know we went over a lot of information and it's a lot to digest, but I hope that this served as a bit of an introduction to what clinical trials are about. Of course, we're not giving this presentation to necessarily encourage you to participate in any specific trial. We have no conflicts of interest, but honestly, clinical trials are very complex. So we hope that this information empowers you to be able to look into trials more in the future or initiate a conversation with your oncologist about clinical trials. So thank you again for your time. We'll be happy to take your questions if you have any, though I cannot guarantee that we will have all of the answers.
I have a question, actually. Would you know what percentage of patients are offered a clinical trial?
Hi, I'll try to answer that. Thanks for your question. To be honest, I'm not too familiar with the answer to that. I would assume that depending on the eligibility criteria, physicians are usually keeping an eye out, for different clinical trials that are occurring at different centers. This is particularly the case for tertiary centers or large academic centers where you usually have large clinical trials running. So if your primary physician or your oncologist is taking care of you, they'll usually see if you're eligible for any trials, and even at rounds, they'll discuss what possible trials you may be eligible for, and then they might relay that information back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to thank you for the clarity of your presentation. It's absolutely superb.
Thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you. That's what we were going for.
Yeah, very, very clear.
I wanted to ask about natural products, things that people take from, a health food store. What sort of rigors are involved in them going on the shelves, or are there any?
So
great question. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, sure. So I can take this one. So yeah, you raise a really interesting point, I think, which is that sometimes there are these natural products that are sold in pharmacies. alongside other medications that people can buy. And it's important to know really what you're getting. The unfortunate reality is a lot of the times these natural products aren't tested. And if they are tested, they're not tested with the same rigor because a lot of them don't go through the Canadian equivalent of the FDA. Now, that's not to say that they don't work. That's not to say that they aren't safe. But the only way that you can officially and conclusively show that something is safe and effective is going through a clinical trial. And that's simply not required for a lot of these natural remedies.
Do you think that it's important to let your oncologist or your healthcare professional know that you're combining maybe any of your treatment with natural products?
Yes, definitely. So that's a very critical point, and thank you for bringing that up. For two reasons. Sometimes the things that you're taking have been shown to demonstrate some sort of effect on the body. So one example of that is St. John's wort. Yeah, so that's a very common one that sort of comes up. Yeah. So St. John's wort is a very important one to keep in mind because, again, doesn't need to go through the same approval as medications. However, it can modify your brain chemistry a little bit. Usually that's fine in a lot of people that take it, and so a lot of people will advocate for it. But in some people, they can have a very adverse reaction to St. John's wort, and it can leave them with disability that they didn't have before, which is very unfortunate. And another important point is sometimes these things can interact both with the medications that you're taking and also with different organ systems in the body. So for example, a lot of herbal remedies you can't take if you have problems with your kidneys because it'll actually hurt your kidneys. So although these are very important treatments for a lot of people, and there's something really gratifying about going to the store, especially a pharmacy, and buying a natural product, you don't necessarily know what you're getting, and it hasn't really been proven effective or safe. So it's something to approach with caution, and definitely to be open and honest with your doctors about that, because they want to work with you, but they want to ensure that that you're safe and you're not exposing yourself to risk of undue harm.
Yeah.
I just want to step in. I don't want to steal the thunder from the people speaking. My name is Sana. I'm a nurse practitioner in medical oncology at the Jewish, and absolutely, like the natural products, they could do very good, help many patients out in the community. But when you're taking very specialized medications, such as anti-cancer drugs, the oncology pharmacy is a great resource for patients. They could ask their infirmière pivot, their liaison nurses, any of the providers, and they will do a very detailed checkup. And just recently I had a patient who wanted to know if she could take her immune boosters. And I was like, what immune boosters? I take echinacea. I'm a healthy 32-year-old. I could take echinacea when I have sniffles. And she showed me this picture of this enzyme immune boosting that she got from the States. I looked it up online, and it had all kinds of raw eggs, enzymes from different animals, 4 different animals. And this is a patient who was taking a chemotherapy drug and was at risk of getting neutropenic, and then she could just get a whole bunch more medications. But an oncology pharmacy actually typed out a whole report for the patient explaining why she shouldn't be taking it. And she was more than willing to stop taking it when she had all this information. So just feel free to refer people to oncology pharmacy, because they'll do all the investigations for you and put it down for the patients in their files as well.
Well, you didn't steal any thunder right there.
No.
I think that the issue is the word natural means safe, and it's not.
Yeah,
So it's
there's
that misconception.
There's such a, and I think that's as a communicator, that's a huge problem, because people automatically, they ascribe value to words, right? So natural automatically is considered good. And nature, hurricanes are natural too. Nobody would call them good, right? Nature just is. But as a society, And I think that's always the stumbling block. Like people are, it's really hard for them to let go of this notion that because it's natural, it is therefore good, whereas something synthetic can't be good because it's manufactured. And that's simply not true. But it's very hard to dislodge people from that way of thinking.
Yeah, I think Hannah's alluding to a good point as well, is that I think sometimes patients just aren't aware, of course. I mean, as you're saying, natural has certain connotations to it. But as you stated, once the pharmacy provided kind of a list of interactions, and the patient they weren't against listening. They just, now that they're informed, they now have those tools to understand that maybe it's not the best idea to take these products. I do have a question that was previously asked by what I presume is a patient, and I'll open it up to my colleagues if they want to take a shot at answering this. So the question they had is, they wanted to know if there are any clinical trials for cervical cancer, specifically for patients that have metastatic cervical cancer. They've done chemo twice, and they're wondering if immunotherapy is available for them and where they can find this information. They've heard of a drug called Keytruda. But unfortunately, it's only approved in the States. The second part of that question is they'd like to know why it takes so long to get into a clinical trial. So if Sarah or Matthew, you want to take that?
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, sure. So there were a few parts to that question regarding any specific trials that are available. I would really recommend using one of those databases that we link to, including the Canadian Registry, because I mean that's really where you're going to be able to find this information. I confess that I don't know of any specific trials currently for that specific clinical situation, but there's certainly a lot of information available online on those registries. In terms of the specific treatment, again, so we're medical students. We're not yet doctors. It'll be a couple years for that. So we can't really advise on any specific medications. We're not really qualified to do so. That's an excellent question. And I think that's something that should definitely be followed up with your doctor or your oncologist. Just to make sure that you're getting accurate information from someone that's really qualified for that. I can address the last part though. So on approval, so certain drugs are approved in the US, certain drugs are approved in Canada. So we have different approval processes in Canada. There's a board that works very, very hard to look at safety data before approving any treatment for people in Canada. For treatments that were developed both here, but also if treatments were developed elsewhere. This is because some of these treatments can be potentially harmful, and large numbers of experts need to determine if the possible benefits of the medication you're talking about are worth the risks of the treatment. And I think there was a question as well, why does it take so long to enroll in clinical trials? I hear you. That's that can be very frustrating, for sure. So I think one of the big points from today is that clinical trials, they're a very complex, orchestrated machine with many, many moving parts. They typically involve large numbers of patients, researchers, healthcare professionals, facilities, and a ton of money. Yeah, it's really, really a large operation. So all of this is basically to ensure that things go smoothly during the trial. Since any logistical or technical difficulties can result in some of the results not actually being useful. So of course you want to make sure that you get really useful results from a clinical trial. Because of all these moving parts, it can take some time to figure out if a patient is eligible to participate in the trial, and also when the trial will officially start. So generally you need to make sure that you have enough eligible participants for a specific arm of the trial in order to start it. So that can take a week or it can take a year, depending on how many patients are eligible. Although it can be very frustrating, and I hear you, and it definitely takes longer than we would like. We would all love to know the answer right away. Is this treatment effective? Because then we could help people. But clinical trials and doing it this way really is the only way that we ultimately determine if we're able to determine if a treatment is effective. So I know it can be frustrating, but I hope that doesn't discourage you. And I hope if you're really interested in specific clinical trials, perhaps for that drug that you mentioned, discuss it with your oncologist or your healthcare team.
To add on to that really quickly, that's the point I wanted to kind of add on to one of Matt's earlier points regarding looking at finding a metastatic cervical cancer trial. While there's all these resources available, and hopefully we introduce some of them to you today, the biggest point of info will be your oncologist. So I think it's really worthwhile to go look into these resources, see if there's any that are of interest to you or you think you're applicable for. But speaking to your oncologist, they will be the person that will be able to give you info about your eligibility, whether it's suitable for your goals. And I'm hoping it's a two-way street, because that really is, in my opinion, what they really should be there for.
Thanks, Sarah and Matthew. Sorry to interrupt, Marcel. I just wanted to add thanks to the two of you for that in-depth response. Maybe what we can do is we can kind of give a hands-on show of how we can use one of these resources, just so that if anyone has a recording of this, they can kind of see us go through it live. And we'll actually take this example of metastatic cervical cancer in Keytruda, and we'll see what we can find. Is that okay, Marcel?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I did put on chat too a link of Onco Quebec and Cuco, which is also, I'm curious to see what you would think of those two sites. But the Jewish General Hospital and other local hospitals, of course, are their clinical trials are there. So maybe it's a good resource. Do you see in your distant future collaboration between cancer centers being together on a trial? If we can go and combine different countries, can we combine local hospitals, or is that being done now today?
Yeah, I'll address that point, Marcel. Thanks for that question. Okay. It's funny because over the weekend there was there's an international consortium called PROCEED, and then that's involving many different countries to try to determine the best preventative strategies for pancreatic cancer. And something that I found was really, I guess, inspirational is that you see different centers from the United States, from Canada, and even from some in the United Kingdom. So I think that idea of collaboration and working with different institutions in different countries is something that's driving a lot of the medical research today, and it's something that we're definitely taught during medical school. And I think it's one of the important qualities of being a physician and a scientist. So it's definitely done nowadays in cancer. Maybe Matthew can talk a bit about some of the neurodegenerative alliances, or Sarah can talk more about some cancer collaborations.
Yeah, I think you gave a really good answer there. I mean, I think the general principle is that the more collaborations we have, both within Canada and internationally, the more efficient we can make these studies, and the quicker we can determine if treatments work. Importantly as well, involving people internationally, we know that sometimes different people respond to drugs differently. So including individuals from other cultures, other parts of the world with different family histories, we can then assess whether or not drugs work across the board, or we can find a situation where it doesn't work. In which case, as John mentioned in his part of the talk, we can go back to basic science and we can figure out why and continuously improve the treatments, reduce side effects, and improve the care that we're able to provide.
And I think another important reason for doing cross clinic and international trials is especially important in rare diseases. So there's certain types of cancers that are by definition much rarer than other ones. And often there's just simply not enough patients at a certain site or even in a certain country to have valid trials. There's unfortunately certain populations, or certain diseases rather, that just simply don't have enough people in it, that these patients haven't had a trial for them. So I think it's really worthwhile to do these international collaborations to see if we can get a substantial number of patients with a certain type of disease to actually see if a certain drug will work for them.
Exactly. So we'll take this example, not to go on for too long, but in this case, the person who asked the question, they were wondering about metastatic cervical cancer and a drug called Keytruda. So we're here on one of the resources that I think Marcel will distribute to the participants later, clinicaltrials.gov, and it's curated by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And it includes information on clinical trials, as you can see here, from all over the United States, as well as over 200 countries, Canada included. So it's fairly straightforward to use. We'll simply type in here the condition or disease, or in this case, cervical cancer. And you can even specify specific stages, but here we'll keep it general. The other term we'd like to look into is Keytruda. And one thing to note is that oftentimes different companies will have different names for similar drugs. So Keytruda is the commercial name for a drug called pembrolizumab, which is a type of immune checkpoint inhibitor. So if you wanted to, for example, investigate a bit more on the type of drug, you might look for the generic name of the drug, and you can input it here. But usually clinical trials are good at indicating both commercial names and generic names. And then here we'll look up Canada. We can specify city as well and how far away from the city if we wanted to. We'll click search. And these are some of the outcomes or the search results that we'll see. So an important column to look at is status. You'll want to look at clinical trials that are recruiting, because those are the ones that are open for patients. Active and not recruiting would simply mean that the clinical trial is still being analyzed or the data is being looked at, but they aren't recruiting any more patients. You can look at the title. If it's of interest to you, it might specify some things that are applicable to you, like cervical cancer and as we said here, pembrolizumab, the conditions that are treated, but more importantly, here are the locations. And indeed, at least for this search result, which we only got 9, it seems like most of them, if not all, are in the United States. So United States, etc. So let's say that there was a study that was being conducted in Canada. What you can do is you can simply, if you wanted to print a sheet of this clinical trial, here's more information that talks about it. But as my colleagues are alluding to, I think the most important thing to note is that the person that you should be discussing all of these terms, concepts, and studies is with your oncologist. So any type of study that you find, any questions that you have, any topics that you want to delve into, speak to them, and they'll be the ones that'll guide you based on what's in your best interest for your health. Were there any other questions? Okay, Marcel, I think I'll pass